Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to go back to history and discuss Catholic persecution during the Elizabethan era. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri Filio et Spiritui Sancto, succuteram in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, I'm going to put some banner notes on similar historical episodes. In particular, we're going to put the one on why the Anglican Church or Episcopalian Church doesn't have apostolic succession. And I'll put a banner in for how a retort to the Catholic Church kills heretics. So let's go back in time. I'm not going to spend too much time on the back history here because I want you to understand that Catholics were persecuted in England for a good 300 years. Now, before that, Catholicism was the church in England for 1,000 years. When Catholicism came to Britannia during the end of the Roman Empire, this is 300s AD, 400 AD, and then it was solidly Catholic up until Henry VIII. And the irony is Henry VIII was given an award by the Pope for being a defender of the faith, because Henry VIII, when he was young, was writing a lot of tracts against Lutheranism. And so the Pope was like, oh, you're a great defender of the faith. Hashtag irony. So we know what happens with Henry VIII. He lets essentially his loins dictate what he wants. He wants to get an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The Pope says no. That's the ultimate expression of pride. I know better. I want what I want. So he rebels. He becomes a schismatic. And when he dies, the Church of England is essentially a schismatic church. It still has apostolic succession and so forth. We know two saints that are pretty famous during this time, John Fisher and of course St. Thomas More, were both bishops that when Henry VIII was demanding that they would be loyal to the Church of England, they said, no, I got to follow my conscience, and they cut off both of their heads. So Henry VIII dies. His son, Edward, who he had with his third wife, the much begotten, needed male heir, sickly kid, he's really manipulated by Archbishop Kramer. Kramer, by this point, is really infused with the Reformed theology or Calvinist theology. And so during his only 9-year reign, it was very short, he changed the role of ordination and the job of the priest, because it became much more Calvinistic. And this is when they lose apostolic succession. And this was dogmatically preached later by Leo XIII in the late part of the 1800s. So Edward dies, and then Mary, who is Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, becomes queen, and she's only a queen for 5 years, and she tries to restore Catholicism and bring England back into unity with Rome. She has Archbishop Kramer burnt at the stake, justifiably so, because you got to understand, I have episodes on this too, back then we didn't separate religion from the state. When you were doing something that was taking souls to hell, that was an act of treason. So in that world, in that milieu, it was quite normal to burn somebody like Kramer at the stake. So Mary dies childless. She is married for a little while to the great champion of Catholicism, Philip II, but they never conceive a child because she's old when they get married. And so Henry VIII's only surviving child, the one he had with Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, becomes queen in 1558. Now by this point, and she is the queen for a good 45 years, till 1603, this is when the Catholic persecution begins. Now, understand a lot of this, like with a lot of the Protestant Reformation, a lot of this is political, but I try to give it a balanced view. So Henry takes the church away from Rome. Now, most of the population of England was not happy with this. In fact, there was a major revolt near the end of his reign, in which especially the Catholic families of the north revolt, because he started sacking the monasteries, because Cromwell, his chancellor, and Kramer were like, well, there's a lot of money here. So they started just sacking the churches, taking all the treasury, taking the money, taking the land, because there was a lot of land. And so the people rebelled against that. Now, when Elizabeth comes into power, Philip II is still the king of England, emperor of Spain, not England. And he wants to bring England and the Low Country, the Netherlands, which was also revolting at this time, back into the bosom of Catholicism. So later, 30 years into the reign, he launches the Spanish Armada to try to bring England back to Catholicism, and it fails. The divine wind, as the Protestants call it, shipwrecked that Armada. But from Elizabeth's perspective is, I need to protect my kingdom from popery. At this point, the Church of England is firmly established. They are changing the theology. I already mentioned that. And so, countered with that, you have the Counter-Reformation. This starts really with the Council of Trent, the mid-1500s. The Jesuits are now finally in full gear. And you have people like, we have an episode on someone like Bellarmine later on. Of course, Pope Pius V, the great pope during this time, and some other great saints are trying to push the Counter-Reformation. So the Jesuits, for example, some of the middle countries of Central Europe started going Protestant. They went in and reestablished it. So the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland came back to Catholicism. And so the Jesuits, being firm, strong Catholics, the true embodiment, this was the old Jesuits, not the late 20th century Jesuits, really wanted to give the sacraments to these English Catholics that were in hiding. Now, to be fair, some of the English did go Protestant, like, yeah, cool, I'm in. Sign me up for this new religion. But a lot of were Catholics, and the priests that were still in England, because they had apostolic succession still, the ones that were still alive that were ordained before Edward changed it, they had to hide because Elizabeth was persecuting priests. And if any priest was found to be doing Mass in secret or administering any of the sacraments, they'd be executed. A famous priest, Edmund Campion, was a Jesuit who was smuggled in. So the Jesuits were trying to smuggle in priests to serve the Catholic people, to give them sacraments. We talked about that in the movie treatment of Scorsese's Silence. The same thing happened in 17th century Japan. So you saw these Jesuits coming in. Elizabeth responded by saying any priest that's caught is going to be murdered, and any Catholic that is harboring priests is going to be executed as well. So St. Margaret Clitheroe is probably the most famous of these martyrs. She was a woman who was hiding a priest, and she didn't want to reveal where priests were at. And so they had her killed, and they had her killed by crushing her under a door. This was not that uncommon, crushing with rocks. So she was pregnant at the time with like her fourth kid, and they just put her door on her and just put stones on her while pregnant until it suffocates, breaks their ribcage. And that's how she died. Now, the persecution of Catholicism continued through the late 1500s with Elizabeth into the Stuart rule with James and Charles, and the Glorious Revolution, the English Civil War, all through the 1600s. This was in practice. And also what was in practice at this time is no Catholic could hold office, no Catholic could hold property, no Catholic could go to universities. And this extended all the way to the 1800s. Now, the Glorious Revolution, now I know this is really boring for certain people who don't like history. The Glorious Revolution was all instigated because Charles I, who is the Stuart guy brought in the Restoration after the English Civil War, was a Protestant, but he had no kids. His brother, James, was a Catholic, became a Catholic, and he married a Catholic woman and a Catholic princess, and they were going to have Catholic kids. So when Charles died, James became the king for 3 years, 1685 to 1688, and this is when the Glorious Revolution happened, because at this point, the Protestant English aristocracy didn't want to have a possible return to Catholicism in England. So they brought in their sister, who was married to William of Orange in the Netherlands, and brought them in and kicked James out. Now, if any of you like Outlander, the novel and then the TV show, Outlander stems from this thing, because James was the legitimate king of England. He gets ousted, he moves to France, he has children, and these are what we call the Jacobites, and they are the true rulers of England. And so later on, Scotland, which is still Catholic, supports James's son and grandson. So you see in 1740 1714 and 1741, two attempts by the Jacobite rulers coming through Scotland, which was still relatively Catholic, especially up in the Highlands, to try to restore Catholicism. So in closing, Catholics were persecuted. It wasn't as much, by the 1700s, it was pretty rare for them to be executed. But they were second-class citizens in England. And it wasn't until 1829 that they passed the rule where they could hold property, they could hold public office, but it was written in the rules that England could never have a Catholic monarch, ever. They could, even to this day, cannot have a Catholic monarch, ever. You cannot have a monarch who converts to Catholicism. So if Queen Elizabeth, or Charles convert to Catholicism, they relinquish the throne. They have to relinquish the throne. And so in 1829, that's when Catholics were not persecuted. But it wasn't until the 1870s that even Catholic youth could go to universities. So you're looking at 1558 to 1871. That's over 300 years of Catholics being persecuted, either a hard persecution in the beginning or a softer one later on. Second-class citizens. And a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people don't know that Catholics were killed and persecuted during especially the reign of Elizabeth and later James. And then we'll have a future episode about Catholic discrimination in the colonies in early American history. Guys, post in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you didn't know this, if you knew about this, hit the notification, subscribe, and share button, share with others. Until next time, take care. God bless and pray.